Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of January. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Kupiansk region with north front line. If you remember yesterday the Russians announced about the ceasefire and but the Western countries and the Ukraine they didn't believe the Russians and they continue offensive operation or defense operation in this area trying to attack the Russians all over the front line. When talking about Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost around 40 soldiers, something around 5 armored vehicles. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost another raider on the north of Kupiansk area. And when talking about this region, we see that Ukrainians they stopped completely, and during the previous 2 or 3 weeks, we haven't received any updates, any report of any attempt from the Ukrainian side to attack in direction of Svatova. But when talking about the Russians on this area, they continue attacking the Ukrainians with artillery and so on, and the losses are not so big. But anyway, if we summarize the losses of the Ukrainians on this front line every single day, we understand that these losses are useless, that the Ukrainians can avoid these losses and can save their manpower. And when talking about today we received the first update from the Russians that the officers from the Russian side, higher rank officers from the Russian side, reported that they spotted some kind of activation on the Kupiansk front line, and to be more precise, the Russians reported that Ukrainians took a decision to start regrouping of their forces from Kupiansk front line, to be more precise, from Kupiansk-Svatov front line in direction of Liman. So the Ukrainians decided to move their forces from this area to the south. If you remember, a few videos ago I told you that we discussed the two versions, one of the from the Ukrainian side. One of the version was from the head of Ukrainian military authorities in Kharkiv region, and another one from the United Kingdom intelligence. And if you remember, the Ukrainians were saying that the head of military authorities of Kharkiv reported that the Russians will try to cut Kharkiv from the Kiev, and the United Kingdom intelligence reported that during the next weeks the Russians will try to attack the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk-Svatov front line with the purpose to encircle this group. So, and today, like few days later, we received first update that the Ukrainians took a decision to move their forces from the north, from Kupiansk front line in direction of Liman area. And this is a very smart decision, of course. When talking about this area, when talking about deployment map, we see that the Kupiansk front line is the weakest point from the Ukrainian side. It is this area is very difficult to support. There are no railroads, there are no electricity maybe in this town, there are no locals in this area who can support the army and so on. So I believe that this is the reason why the Ukrainians decided to step back, just with one purpose: to save their army in this area. And I believe that because of the fact that the Ukrainians decided to step back from Kupiansk, from this front line, I believe that the next weeks the Russians will activate this front line and will make few attempts to return control over Kupiansk. And the main purpose of upcoming operation from the Russian side, of course, is to restore the railroad that supports Svatova with the mainland. So we can understand this, and of course all these things are completely correlates with the situation we heard during the previous days. Now, when talking about Liman front line, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and around 3 commandos groups in the area of Kreminna. The Ukrainians continue storming this town. We haven't received a lot of updates from the open sources, but this piece of news about regrouping of Ukrainians from Kupiansk, about losses among this territory, we understand that the Ukrainians maybe plans to increase the pressure against this town, and maybe they will be able to achieve some success. For now, there are no progress at all. When talking about Bakhmut, Soledar, Seversk area, as you can see, there are a lot of updates and there are a lot of icons in the area of Soledar. During this day, we received a lot of updates from the Russian sources that they managed to penetrate the Ukrainians' defense orders, that they managed to take a lot of territories, that they forced the Ukrainians to step back. They were saying that Ukrainians were running from the combat line and from the contact line and so on. And as you can see, there is an icon on the south in the area Krasnogora. The Russians reported that 128th Mountain Assault Brigade were forced to step back in direction of Krasnogora. When talking about Soledar, the Ukrainians were forced to step back in the middle part of Soledar. The Russians established final control over Bakhmut and everything as we discussed during the previous videos. But I would like to add one important note. First of all, let's discuss Soledar one more time. The Ukrainians, as we discussed, I believe in the previous videos, the Ukrainians now have their defense line on this area in Soledar, something like this. They try to build their defense line along the railroad and along the river. And the main heart of defense area in this town is the middle part, this one. According to the Russians report, the Ukrainians step back exactly in this area. And when we take a look at this map, we see that there is a residential area with high buildings, and this area is located on the hill. Furthermore, don't forget about salt caves that located under this area. So they decided to build their defense in this area. And to tell the truth, it's not running away, as a lot of Russian military channels, military experts were saying. It's not running away. It's just stepping back towards more reliable positions, because the area that located on the east and the south from this residential area, I'm talking about like Bakhmutsk, about this village, is completely ruined. There are no more places where the Ukrainians are able to hide. Furthermore, don't forget that the Russians pushes from the Yakovlevka along these brushes, and the Russians' resources of offensive operation from Yakovlevka is not endless. And I believe that they are not able to develop further, because in this case they need to cross the fields, completely mined fields along the brushes. And it's, if you want to move along the brushes, of course the best solution is to build trenches and to move along trenches. So, and now it's winter, the ground is completely freezed. Maybe there are some Ukrainian trenches, I'm not sure, but anyway, the Russian possibilities on the north of Soledar, between Yakovlevka and Soledar, is not so big. They can move a little bit, but they will, I believe that this icon show maybe the exact position that the Russians are able to achieve in this area. If they try to move further, they will get onto fields and they will got into back, and they will be under attack from Krasnopolovka, from the residential area of Soledar, and from the town that's located on the west from this area. When talking about the south, there is the same situation. And now the Ukrainians try to prepare another defense line along the Krasnogora, this town. We know that the Ukrainians tried to hold Podgorodny, and the battle for Podgorodny started a few weeks ago, and the Russians still couldn't take control over this. And when talking about north of Soledar, of course, the Ukrainians tries to prepare to build their defense line along Krasnopopovka and Razdolovka. So the only thing that Ukrainians did today, they stepped back inside the fortress, inside of towns. And when talking about the Russians these days found themselves in the fields, in the open air. And to tell the truth, this is not a very good option for the Russians. Of course, I'm not saying that the Russians are not able to take any of these towns. I believe that the next week or maybe 2 weeks we're going to see update from Podgorodny. Podgorodny anyway is going to fall. The Russians are able to take control over this town. It's not a difficult job. I believe that the Russians are able to take Krasnogora for many reasons: support, supply, because of absence of supply and support of these two towns. When talking about Soledar, I'm not sure that the Russians are able to take Soledar, at least the middle part. Maybe I'm speculating, of course. Maybe today the Russians were completely right about the fact that the Ukrainians were forced to step back from almost entire Soledar. But let's wait a little bit. And I believe that today or tomorrow we are going to understand that the Ukrainians are not planning to give up and to step back from Soledar. They just returned or moved towards more reliable positions. When talking about Razdolovka and Krasnopopovka, these two towns, the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation through the fields in direction of Razdolovka, through the fields in direction of Krasnopopovka, but I believe that this case they will have a lot of losses, and I'm not sure they're ready to do this. When talking about Vysyola, I believe that the Russians are able to take this town, and furthermore, I believe that Ukrainians will be forced to step back. It's not like. Of course, there is a lot of value in this town from the Ukrainian side, but I believe that at this moment, the price that Ukrainians will pay for holding this town is much higher than the value of this town. So I believe that the next week we are going to receive something like this about the front line in this area. The Ukrainians will step back and the Russians will establish real control, complete control over these towns like Vysyola, Belogorovka, Yakovlevka, and the Western sources map will be updated. When talking about this area, I believe as well, Krasnogora, Podgorodny, and Bakhmutska. Bakhmutska is already under Russian control according to their map, but the Western source map will be updated as well. About Soledar, I will repeat one more time, I'm not sure that the Russians are able to take this town, at least these days, when there are complete, very safe roads to supply and support this area. And when talking about Donetsk area, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes in Soledar, when talking about Bakhmut, don't forget that Wagner's, there is only one army, one forces who stormed Bakhmut and Soledar, and I'm talking about Wagner's. Today, Prigozhin, the head of Wagner's, made his own report, and he told us about some complex and in Bakhmut, about some difficulties and so on. And today, during the day, we received update about the fact that maybe Soledar has been collapsed, but later Prigozhin gave his own update that he asked people not to hurry, to wait. There are still heavy clashes inside of Soledar, and so he just asked to wait a little bit because he don't want to make to tell the thing that not exist. When talking about south of Bakhmut, there are still clashes in Klishchiivka, but as you can see, the front line has been stabilized. The Ukrainians still have supply and support of this area, and for now Klishchiivka is still under Ukrainian control or maybe in the gray zone. When talking about east part of Bakhmut, the Russians pushes. Let's take a look at the Russian sources map. You see that there is an update. There are a lot of updates in this area. That almost the entire forest under Russian control nowadays shows the east streets in this area is under Russian control. Furthermore, Ivangrad has been updated almost to the north to the dam, and Opatna still as we saw a few days ago. So for now, Bakhmut we can say is without no changes. Very interesting updates are coming from Kurdyumovka. If you remember, a few videos ago, we had a report that Ukrainians managed to enter the north part of Kurdyumovka, this area. We also had this update on the deployment map that they made some kind of counter-offensive operation. But today, everybody confirms that Ukrainians were forced to step back and were defeated in Kurdyumovka, and now there is 100% control over this town. Now let's move to Donetsk front line. When talking about Donetsk, Pesky front line is stable, Marinka front line is stable. There are very heavy clashes, but without any progress on the ground. So the Ukrainians still do have possibility to move reserves, and these reserves are enough to stop the Russians or to slow down them. When talking about artillery duels, as you can see, the Russians destroy air defense system S-300 in the north of Avdiivka. The Russians destroy another howitzer in the small town Pobeda that located on the south of Marinka, D-20. And I believe that that's it. No, nothing more. Just the regular attacks against the accumulation of Ukrainian forces along the South Donetsk front line. And when talking about South Donetsk, the Ukrainian lost around 50 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles on the South Donetsk front line. When we're moving to Zaporozhye, we see that the Russians continue artillery duels, and during the previous 24 hours, the Russians reported they managed to destroy one artillery system M77, one howitzer 777. And to tell the truth, that's it. That's all updates about the clashes on the ground. When talking about deployment map, we see another important update near Soledar that shows the real picture there. The Ukrainians step back and they moved their 128th 28th Mountain Assault Brigade. This brigade used to stay in Bakhmut in Soledar, but during the previous weeks of heavy clashes, they were forced to step back. The Russians are saying that this is one of the most powerful and elite forces in Ukraine, and they were right in front of being completely collapsed and reduced to zero. So that's why the Ukrainian commanders decided to move this brigade from the front line to fulfill this army, to reinforce this army, and so on. Very interesting updates are coming from the Western countries, and I believe that we need to discuss them as well. First of all, I would like to remind you one more time that yesterday the Russians announced about ceasefire all over the front line, but when talking about the Western countries, they refused this ceasefire. Zelensky refused this ceasefire, and a lot of Western countries refused this fire. Furthermore, the Western countries announced about another upcoming supply and support of Ukraine, and this is very important support because when talking about the United States of America, they promised to give the Ukrainians 50 units of armored vehicles by the name of Bradley. This is a very powerful United States armored vehicle, and they promised to bring around 50 units. When talking about this Bradley, and when talking about the total possibilities of United States of America to supply Ukraine with this type of weapon, we can say that there are around 2,000 units that the United States of America, approximately, that the United States of America have by today. And during the first support of 2023, they decided to provide 50 units. So I believe that during the year, the United States of America are able to provide around 500 units of these armored vehicles. And now we talk a lot about upcoming counteroffensive operation from the Ukrainian side that they're planning to make during March, and I believe that during January, by the end of January and February, we are going to see more updates from the United States of America about upcoming supports. And now the United States of America start preparation of Ukrainians of a counteroffensive operation from their side that they're planning to make in spring, during the spring, or to be precise, during the March of 2023. Furthermore, when talking about Germany, they promised to provide the Ukrainians around 40 units of Marder. It's analog of Germany armored vehicle, and when talking about the total possibilities of Germany to supply Ukraine with this type of weapon, the Germany has around 100 or 120 units of this type of weapon. So as you can see, completely different situation with the United States of America that has around 2,000 units, and when talking about Germany, they have just 100 and 120, and they promised to give 40 units. So that means that they have already complete complete this, so they are not able to provide more. They need to produce, and after that they will be able to give more. Germany promised to provide their own light tanks AMX-10, and they didn't tell us the real number of how much they are planning to provide to Ukraine, but the total possibilities of Germany in this type of armored vehicles is around 100 units. So as you can see, Germany and France have promised to provide almost like 50% of their possibilities. And so I believe that if they decide to provide more, first they need to produce or to do something with the rest of these units they have. But when talking United States of America, as you can see, 50 units from 2000 in stock, it's nothing. So I believe they will continue providing the Ukrainians this type of armored vehicles. And furthermore, don't forget that the head of Ukrainian intelligence during the January reported that they're planning, or they see that in March we're going to see the most heaviest battle since the beginning of special operation, and this is going to be like breaking battle that should break the situation in Ukrainian favor, and after that the Ukrainians will just push, and the Russians, according to the Western sources, will be forced to leave the entire territory of Ukraine. We'll see what's going to be. But what I see right now, I see that the situation that the Russians got the initiative, that everything on the front line works in Russian favor. Furthermore, today we receive a lot of updates, a lot of pictures from the territory of Belarus. Today, the president of the Republic of Belarus visited and inspected the Belarusian forces on the territory of Belarus, and he reported that this army is ready to complete the goals of these allies between Belarus and Russia. They show like the camp of forces, the armored vehicles. Today we saw another convoys of armored vehicles that were deployed on the territory of Belarus. I'm not saying that anybody is going to attack from Belarus, but anyway, the Ukrainians need to pay attention to this situation. And the most important, they are forced to deploy forces on the border with Belarus just with on purpose to be on the safe side, and they are forced to deploy the forces that they could use on the, let's say, in Bakhmut, but for now they are not able to do this. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.